On the night of March 29th, 1987, inside a cavernous dome in Pontiac, Michigan, a blond man in a yellow shirt bent down, wrapped his arms around a 525-pound monster and lifted him off the ground. The building did not cheer. The building screamed. The promotion claimed 93,173 people were packed into that arena, a number scribbled, by some accounts, on a cocktail napkin backstage. Even the honest estimates land near 78,000. Either way, it was the largest crowd ever assembled to watch men pretend to fight, and the man doing the lifting was a 33-year-old, who, barely a decade earlier, had been playing bass guitar in Florida bars for a few hundred drunks a night. Here are the numbers. He held the most important championship in his industry for 1,474 straight days, the longest single reign of his entire era. He became the most requested celebrity of the 1980s for the Make-A-Wish Foundation, ahead of every movie star and pop idol in the country. He sold so much merchandise out of the trunk of his own car that he turned a cotton t-shirt into a multi-million-dollar empire. He was the first professional wrestler ever to appear on the cover of Sports Illustrated, and for decades, the only one. 171 different action figures of his likeness were manufactured across 30 years. And listen to the man whose entire job was tracking this business. Wrestling historian Dave Meltzer, a notoriously hard grader, said it plainly after the icon's death. He sold more tickets to wrestling shows than any man who ever lived. Not one of the best. The single biggest draw the industry has ever produced. A bar musician who couldn't get a record deal, who would die in 2025 as one of the most recognizable human beings on the planet. So, how did a Florida bar musician become the biggest name in wrestling history? He was not born Hulk Hogan. He was born Terry Gene Bollea on August 11, 1953, in Augusta, Georgia, the youngest son of a construction foreman and a homemaker who taught dance on the side. While he was still a small child, the family moved to Tampa, Florida, and that is where the legend and the insecurity took root. You picture the body that unconquered arenas. Forget it. The boy was overweight and miserable in his own skin. In his own telling, he had the largest head in his elementary school, and the other kids made sure he knew it. He was so ashamed of how he looked that he refused to take his shirt off at the beach. The future symbol of physical perfection. The man who would one day pose his bronzed muscles for screaming millions was a fat kid who hid his body from the world. There was one thing he could do. He could throw. Terry Bollea was a genuine baseball talent, a pitcher good enough that major league scouts were watching him. For a kid with nothing else, that arm was a ticket out. And then, at 16, an injury ended it. The dream that was supposed to carry him died before he ever left Tampa, so he turned to the other thing, music. He had started on guitar in junior high because he wasn't, in his words, a big sports guy. He had long hair and a fixation on the bands of the era. Then a better guitarist showed up in one of his groups, and young Terry faced a choice: leave or learn bass. He chose bass, and he chose to get good at it. He poached the best players out of 5 or 6 local bands and assembled one outfit called Ruckus. They played rock and roll covers and a handful of originals, working the Florida nightclub circuit for cash. 10 years on the road in one band or another. And here is the detail that changes everything. The wrestlers came to the bars. The Florida territory was thick with grapplers, and they drank where Rucker played. Night after night, this enormous long-haired bass player stood on a small stage, working a rowdy room, learning the one skill that no wrestling school can teach: how to make a crowd of strangers feel something. He did not know it yet, but the bar wasn't a dead end. It was the training ground. One night, around 1976, a man walked into a Tampa nightclub called The Other Place. His name was Jack Briscoe, and he was one of the most respected wrestlers alive, a former world champion. 2 women had dragged him there to see a band they loved. Briscoe walked in near midnight, looked at the stage, and could not believe his eyes. Standing there, 21 years old and built like a Greek statue, was a kid with a bass guitar. He was so impressive, Briscoe couldn't look away. Briscoe told him to be at the Sportatorium at 9 in the morning. The kid was there at 8:45, waiting out front. That eagerness is the whole story. He wanted it that badly. What came next was not glamorous. It was a leg break. The man assigned to train him was Hiro Matsuda, a Japanese wrestler with a sadist's reputation, and on Belair's very first day, Matsuda snapped his leg. It was a test, the brutal old-school filter designed to find out whether a soft, pretty bar musician would quit. Most did. Belair healed and came back. He came back, and they let him in. He debuted in 1977 in Fort Myers. For years, he was a journeyman with a rotating cast of names, wrestling under a hood as the Super Destroyer, then as Sterling Golden, then as Terry Boulder. The name that stuck came by accident. He went on a talk show and sat beside Lou Ferrigno, the bodybuilder who played the Incredible Hulk on television. Belair, at 6'7", physically dwarfed the actual Hulk. The host said so. And just like that, he was Terry the Hulk Boulder. Then Hollywood called, literally. Terry Funk recommended him to Sylvester Stallone, and Stallone cast him in Rocky III as a loudmouth wrestler named Thunderlips, squaring off with Rocky Balboa in the film's opening fight. It should have been the break of a lifetime. Instead, it got him fired. The old guard ran wrestling like a closed church, and the man who then controlled his contract told him it was wrestling or Hollywood, not both. They cut him loose. So he went to Minnesota, to Vern Gagne's territory, and something started happening. The Hulkamania t-shirts he printed and sold out of his trunk began moving faster than anyone expected. The crowd was telling him something the bookers hadn't figured out yet. They didn't just like this guy. They wanted to follow him. In 1983, a young, ruthless promoter named Vince McMahon took control of his father's company and decided to do something the wrestling world considered insane. He was going to take a regional, almost shameful business, run by territorial bosses who carved up the country like mob families, and turn it into a single national television product. He needed a face. He needed a star so magnetic that a mother in Iowa and a kid in Brooklyn and a businessman in California would all want to watch the same man on the same night. He chose the bar musician. On January 23, 1984, inside Madison Square Garden, Hulk Hogan stepped into the ring against the Iron Sheik, a snarling villain billed as an Iranian menace at the exact moment. America's relationship with Iran was poisonous. The Sheik locked in his finishing hold, the camel clutch, a move no challenger had ever escaped. Hogan powered out of it. He fired off a leg drop. The referee counted 3, and in 5 minutes and 40 seconds it was over. Commentator Gorilla Monsoon shouted 4 words that would define a generation. Hulkamania is here. And then the machine roared to life. McMahon pushed his new champion straight into the mainstream. Hogan brushed his 24-inch arms, which he called his pythons, against pop royalty. He partnered with Cyndi Lauper for a crossover with MTV called The Rock and Wrestling Connection. Andy Warhol turned up at his matches. He co-hosted Saturday Night Live. He got his own Saturday morning cartoon. In March of 1985, he headlined the very first WrestleMania, teaming with the television star Mr. T against Roddy Piper and Paul Orndorff, with Muhammad Ali working as a special referee and Liberace ringing the bell. Wrestling had never had a night like it. But here is the wall, and you have to be honest about it. Hulk Hogan was not a great wrestler. Not in the technical sense. There were dozens of men on that roster who could do more in the ring, who could chain holds and tell intricate stories with their bodies. The purists sneered. His matches followed the same simple recipe every single time. He gets beaten down, he looks finished, he starts shaking, he hulks up, he no longer feels the pain. 3 punches, a big boot, the leg drop, the pin. It should have gotten boring. It never did. Because greatness in this strange business was never about the moves. It was about whether 80,000 people would rise to their feet and believe. And no one, before or since, made them believe like he did. The thing that separated Hogan from every gifted technician who looked down on him was the thing he'd learned in those Florida bars, refined now into something almost supernatural. He understood that the crowd was the show. The wrestlers were just the band. Watch the formula again, but watch it the way he built it. The beating in the middle of the match was not weakness. It was setup. Every kick he absorbed, every slam he took, every moment he lay motionless while the villain gloated, was loading a spring. He was teaching the audience to ache. And the longer he made them ache, the bigger the release when he finally pointed a finger, started to vibrate with fury, and rose. The hulking up was not athletic. It was theatrical. It was a bar musician working the room, holding the silence before the chorus, and then detonating it. He gave his followers a creed. He called them Hulkamaniacs and handed them 3 demandments: train, say your prayers, and eat your vitamins. Later he added a 4th, believe in yourself. It was corny. It was also genuinely shaping millions of children who lined up to meet him, who saw him as a real-life superhero rather than a performer. That status was so total that the Make-A-Wish Foundation named him the most requested celebrity of the entire decade. Not the most requested wrestler, the most requested human being. McMahon's gamble had paid off beyond any sane projection. Attendance records fell. Pay-per-view, a brand new idea, suddenly had a reason to exist. Television ratings climbed. And it all rode on the broad back of a man the critics insisted couldn't really wrestle. They were measuring the wrong thing. You don't measure a hurricane by the rules of a breeze. By the middle of the decade, the question was no longer whether Hulk Hogan could carry the business. The question was whether anything could be built big enough to hold what he had become. McMahon decided to find out. He decided to build the biggest stage in the history of the sport and put on it the one match guaranteed to break every record there was. To understand the mountain Hogan climbed, you have to first understand the man waiting at the top of it. His name was Andre Rene Roussimoff, and the world knew him as Andre the Giant. Andre was not a gimmick. He was a medical phenomenon, a man whose body simply kept growing, billed at 7 feet and over 500 pounds. For years, he had been sold to the public as undefeated and, more powerfully, as unslammable, a creature so massive that no human being could lift him off the canvas. Whether that was literally true did not matter. The audience believed it, and belief was the only currency that counted. Andre was Hogan's friend in real life, and for a long stretch his ally on television. And then the story turned him. It started on an interview segment, when the company handed Hogan a trophy for 3 years as champion. Andre, his old friend, came out to congratulate him and muttered something cold and strange. 3 years to be a champion, it's a long time. The seed of betrayal. Soon Andre, guided by the snake-tongued manager, Bobby Heenan, accused Hogan of dodging him, of being a friend only to avoid a real fight. He ripped the crucifix and the shirt right off Hogan's chest. The friendship was dead. The match was set. WrestleMania 3. The 2 enormous men walked to that ring carrying a secret the cheering thousands could not see. Andre was in agony. The same gigantism that made him a legend was crushing his own skeleton. His back was failing. He had undergone surgery only months before and wore a brace beneath his singlet. There were real doubts, backstage, about whether he could even go, whether the slam was physically possible. Now picture it, the dome is a wall of sound. Hogan walks toward the giant slowly, and the 2 of them simply stand there, face to chest, while the building shakes. The match itself is not a clinic. It is a slow, heaving collision of 2 impossible bodies. Early on, Hogan tries to lift him, and he can't. Andre crashes down on top of him and nearly ends it right there. The crowd gasps. This is the genius of it, the doubt planted live. Maybe the giant really cannot lamanabiantet. Maybe tonight is the night Hulkamania dies. Andre whips him to the ropes. He lunges for a boot to the face. Hogan ducks. He bounces back and runs straight into the giant, a clothesline, and for the first time the mountain wobbles. Hogan feels it. The crowd feels it. He starts to shake. He bends down. He digs his hands under 525 pounds of failing, brace-wrapped legend and he heaves. Andre goes up. Andre comes crashing down. The body slam heard around the world. Hogan hits the ropes, drops the leg, and the count of 3 sets off a roar that almost 40 years later still raises the hair on your arms. Was it the first time Hogan ever slammed Andre? No. He'd done it back in 1980, at a stadium show in New York, when he was still a villain and Andre was still the hero. The unslammable giant had been slammed before by other men in other rings. None of that mattered. The story said it was impossible, and the story made it true, and that is the deepest secret of why this man ruled. He didn't win arguments about facts. He won the only argument that filled buildings, the one about what the moment felt like. But before the giant, there was the loud mouth, and you cannot tell this story without him. The man who made Hogan's heroism mean anything in the first place was a wild-eyed Scotsman in a kilt named Rowdy Roddy Piper. Piper was everything Hogan was not. A brilliant, motor-mouthed villain who could talk an arena into a frenzy and never needed to win a single match to do it. On his talk segment, Piper's Pit, he smashed a coconut over a beloved wrestler's skull and rubbed a banana in his face, and the audience hated him with a purity that money cannot buy. That hatred was the fuel. Hogan needed a devil for his angel to mean anything, and Piper was the perfect devil, the snarling chaos that made the hero's victory feel like the sun coming up. Their collision headlined the first WrestleMania, and the genius of it was that Piper was so good at being despised that he made a limited wrestler look like salvation. The reign that followed was a parade of monsters built to be knocked down. He held that championship across 1,474 unbroken days. And the most personal war of all was with the Macho Man Randy Savage, a coiled, paranoid genius in sequins, who was, at various times, Hogan's tag team partner, his closest friend on the roster, and the man who hated him most. The story turned on Savage's valet, the quiet and beloved Miss Elizabeth, and on Savage's gnawing jealousy that the crowd loved the big blonde hero more than him. The slow poison of that resentment built for months until it exploded. And at WrestleMania 5, the two former friends tore into each other with a venom that felt frighteningly real, Elizabeth stranded between them, not knowing whose corner to stand in. It was, by some distance, the best in-ring drama Hogan was ever part of, and it worked precisely because the audience had watched the friendship curdle in real time. He then faced the Ultimate Warrior at WrestleMania 6 in a rare hero versus hero collision, and in one of the classiest acts of his career, lay on the mat and passed the torch, letting the painted newcomer pin him clean. When the formula needed a fresh nightmare, the company built one. A 400-pound earthquake of a man, a giant who choked Hogan unconscious on national television while grown adults wept and children screamed. And every time, the same release. The shaking, the boot, the leg, the roar. Other promotions ran on intricate work rate and grappling. McMahon's empire ran on one man's ability to make an entire nation hold its breath and then exhale at once. For most of a decade, Hulk Hogan was not the best wrestler in the world. He was something the best wrestlers could never be. He was the gravity the whole sport orbited. But the superhero was made of the same flesh as everyone else, and that flesh had a secret. In 1991, sitting across from Arsenio Hall on national television, Hogan looked into the camera and told the children of America the truth as they needed to hear it. He had trained 20 years, 2 hours a day, to look the way he looked. He was not a steroid abuser. He did not use steroids. He said it cleanly, like a creed, the same voice that told them to eat their vitamins. It was a lie. 3 years later, in 1994, it all came apart in a federal courtroom. The government was prosecuting Vince McMahon, accusing him of running a steroid pipeline to his wrestlers. And the prosecution's star witness, the man who walked to the stand to testify, was Hulk Hogan himself, granted immunity in exchange for the truth. Under oath, the real American admitted it. He had been using anabolic steroids for years, going back into the 1970s. The 24-inch pythons, the bronzed superhero physique that millions of kids had been taught to idolize and emulate, had been chemically built, and he had looked those kids in the eye and denied it. Sit with the weight of that. This was a man whose entire fortune was built on being a role model, on being the honest, clean, prayer-saying hero who proved good guys finish first. And the foundation of that image, the body itself, was a deception. McMahon was acquitted. But something in the Hogan myth cracked that would never fully seal. Some fans branded him a traitor for testifying against the boss who made him. Others simply felt the cold realization that the superhero had been selling them something that wasn't real. He had spent his life learning to make crowds believe. The tragedy buried in that gift is that he could make them believe things that weren't true. And for a long time, he had. By the mid-90s, the red and yellow had faded. A new audience was growing up, and they were tired of the cartoon hero shaking his finger and telling them to take their vitamins. In World Championship Wrestling, the rival company he jumped to, the crowds were starting to boo the man they once worshipped. The act was old, and then he did the most important thing of his entire career after the body slam. He killed Hulk Hogan. July 7th, 1996, Daytona Beach. Two invaders, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, had been terrorizing the company, promising a mysterious third man. The fans assumed Hogan was riding to the rescue, the hero who always saved the day. He marched to the ring, and then he dropped his leg across a fallen good guy and stood with the villains. The crowd did not cheer. They went silent, then erupted in rage, then hurled garbage into the ring in a storm of trash so thick you could barely see the men standing in it. He grabbed the microphone and told them to shut their mouths. He spat that he'd made this whole industry, that he was bored, that these two outsiders were the only friends worth having. He called the three of them the New World Order. Hulk Hogan was dead. Hollywood Hogan, dressed in black, was born. It was the single biggest reinvention in wrestling history, and it worked beyond anyone's dreams. The New World Order angle vaulted WCW past McMahon's company and kept it there for 83 consecutive weeks in the ratings war they called the Monday Night Wars. The bar musician had done it again. He'd read the room the way he read every room since the 1970s, and he'd given them exactly the shock they didn't know they wanted. The wheel kept turning. WCW eventually collapsed, swallowed by McMahon, and in 2002, Hogan came home for one last unforgettable night. At WrestleMania, in his villain's black, he faced the company's biggest new star, The Rock. He was supposed to be the bad guy. But the moment his music hit, the crowd betrayed the script and roared for the old hero anyway. So loudly that both men abandoned their roles mid-match and simply gave the people the passing of the torch they were demanding. The Rock won, Hogan lost, and losing in front of a building that loved him in spite of everything, he tore his shirt one more time. Some have called it the greatest match in WrestleMania history. Not for a single move, but for the wave of pure feeling it unleashed. Strip away the bandanas and the entrance music and the 1,474 days, and look at what actually happened here. A bullied, overweight kid in Tampa lost the one talent that was supposed to save him. He drifted into music because it was all he had left, and he spent 10 years on small stages in dark bars, learning the one thing he'd carry the rest of his life. How to take a room full of strangers and bend their emotions to his will. He never became a rock star. He got discovered almost by accident by a wrestler who walked into the right nightclub on the right night. He couldn't really wrestle, not the way the artists could. He had no business becoming the most famous athlete entertainer on earth. And yet the very thing that should have disqualified him became the engine of everything. He understood, in his bones, that wrestling was never a sport you watched. It was a feeling you shared. The grapplers who looked down on him were playing the instrument. Hogan was conducting the audience. When he bent down to lift Andre, He wasn't performing a feat of strength. He was hitting the final note of a song he'd been building toward his whole life. The chorus the whole stadium had been waiting to scream. The kid who hid his body at the beach died as the man whose body launched a billion-dollar industry into the mainstream. The musician who couldn't get a record deal became, in Meltzer's flat assessment, the man who sold more wrestling tickets than anyone who ever lived. He didn't change his dream. He'd just found the only stage big enough to hold the gift the bars had given him. So where does he actually rank? And here you have to be careful, and you have to be honest, because the answer is genuinely complicated. If the question is who was the greatest in-ring performer, Hogan is not at the top, and he'd half admit it. He once said he considered himself the second greatest wrestler ever, behind Ric Flair, the silver-tongued artist who could carry a broomstick to a five-star classic. Steve Austin and The Rock came after him and arguably eclipsed his peak as cultural lightning rods of the Attitude Era. John Cena carried the company longer. Andre the Giant was a bigger natural marvel. On pure craft, Hogan loses several of those arguments. But change the question. Ask who was the biggest draw, the single most important figure in turning a regional carnival act into a global empire, and the debate ends. Without Hogan, McMahon's national gamble likely fails. Without that gamble, there is no WrestleMania as we know it, no billion-dollar television deals, no modern industry. Cody Rhodes called his match with The Rock the greatest in wrestling history. Chris Jericho, who worked with both, said Hogan was a better worker than even Flair, and called it one of his favorite moments. The biggest stars who followed him all walked through a door he built. And then there is the part of the legacy that no honest accounting can skip. The clean superhero was not a clean man. He admitted in court to years of steroids after denying it to children. In 2012, a secretly recorded sex tape surfaced, leading to a privacy lawsuit financed by a Silicon Valley billionaire that won him a verdict of $140 million, later settled near $31 million, and bankrupted the media company that posted it. But buried in that same recording was something far uglier. Hogan using vicious racial slurs. When it leaked in 2015, his own company erased him, terminating his contract and scrubbing him from its history before later, controversially, bringing him back. His final public appearances drew real boos mixed with the cheers. When he died on July 24, 2025, of a heart attack at 71 in his Clearwater home, the tributes and the condemnations arrived in the same breath, a divided reckoning for a divided man. So how good was he, actually? As a wrestler, very good and wildly overachieving. Never the best. As a draw and a cultural force, the single most important figure the industry has ever produced. And as a human being, deeply, painfully flawed. The honest verdict is the only one big enough to fit him. Hulk Hogan was not the greatest wrestler who ever lived. He was the biggest in every sense of that word, the triumphant and the troubling alike. The bar musician walked onto the biggest stage in the world, lifted a giant over his head, and never came down until everything that made him also unmade him. The body slam was real. The roar was real. The shadows were real too. But the man he slammed that night in Pontiac carried a tragedy of his own. A body that made him a legend and then destroyed him from the inside. Next time, we tell the story of Andre the Giant, the loneliest superstar who ever lived, and the unbearable size of being the eighth wonder of the world.